1 week season.
Hey, and welcome in OWS fam. So glad you are with us. We are back in the DFS lab and excited for Showdown tonight. As always, this a show presented by 1 week season where we build a DraftKings lineup and then use it as a way to talk through tonight's Showdown matchup. Ravens at Chargers. The Ravens road favorites by 2.5. I'm your host Cheeseman, and I'm welcoming up Xandamere now. And Xandamere, how did week 12 finish out on another weird week? We've had a lot of weird weeks this year, and this week it was, the Dallas Cowboys beating the Commanders. Who would have guessed that? And just a lot of other just very surprising outcomes.
Good morning. It's like our brains attached to outlier outcomes. We tend not to expect them, and then we tend to forget how often they actually occur. That's just the way we think, right? It's just the way human brain works. We tend to look for the likelier outcome and then are shocked when it doesn't happen. The Cowboys beating the Commanders was, wow. Like it's the breaks football, right? Like underdogs win, underdogs win a shocking percentage of the time, but it was a weird week in some ways. Once again, for the second week in a row, I had most of my lineups invested in the two games that had the highest Vegas total of the week, which were Lions Colts and was it Cardinals
Seahawks. Cardinals,
yeah. And so that's where most of my game stacks were built around, and those two games didn't just go under. They had the two lowest scoring games of the week, so they didn't just go under, they went way under. And last week it was, I think they were the lowest and the third lowest for the two highest Vegas total games. And that just happens, right? Like it sucks because once again, I said this last week where I felt like I largely nailed the individual plays, and it was the game stacks that missed. And once again, it was the same thing here. And I was sitting here like after the early games, I was like, okay, I feel really good. I'd missed most of the landmines from the early games. Like I had Kareem Hunt, but I was under the field on him. Like my highest owned running back was Bucky Irving, who put up the highest running back score of the week at very low ownership. Awesome. So like I felt really good after the early games were coming to a close. And then I was thinking, okay, just need Arizona, Seattle. And in that game, they had one offensive touchdown. It was the highest total game of the week. One offensive touchdown scored. And despite all that, like I even still had some lineups that were getting close to the top. And, I had a lineup that would have, I don't think it would have won, but it would have been a high, like a third or fourth place finish in a GPP that would have paid for the week. And Kyler Murray just whiffs on a wide open Trey McBride in the end zone. Like I could have made that throw, you could have made that throw. Yeah. And Kyler just misses him. And so it's just that kind of week, and poor Trey McBride, Trey McBride has going into the week, he already had the most receiving yards of any player in the league without having scored a touchdown. And then he goes over 100 receiving yards. Again, it's like, poor guy cannot buy a touchdown.
Seriously,
that was a drag. And then I played Showdown last night, and I had one of my lineups was in first place, basically from like most of the game. I had a lineup in first place, and then until the last play of the game, in which Matt Stafford hits Cooper Kupp for a meaningless garbage time touchdown, and I end up missing first place by 0.02 points. A 50th of a point, which actually might be my narrow.
God.
And Showdown has this, right? Like I've lost Showdown on kneel downs. Like I remember listening to a Showdown on a Josh Allen kneel down once.
Of course, we all remember Demarcus Robinson, how near and dear he is to your heart.
Oh yeah, that guy.
Costing you millions.
Well, not millions, but a lot.
Maybe 5 figures at least.
It was a 6-figure one, unfortunately, for Demarcus Robinson. So not a fan of him. But it's the nature of the game, right? Like game moves on these very narrow things in Showdown, because any player that does anything is going to swing the slate because someone owns that guy, and especially if it's a big name guy, Cooper Kupp, obviously highly owned. He didn't end up in the optimal on FanDuel, at least. It was Matt Stafford. But yeah, Matt Stafford pushed ahead of my Puka Nacua by 0.02 points. So, it was just a bit of a drag of a week for me. But, onward we go, right? Like all we can do is try to make good plays, try to play smart lineups. The chips fall where they may, right? We cannot control outcomes. And I say this a lot. If we cannot control outcomes, we cannot predict outcomes. Like, we're not in the business of predicting outcomes because it's not possible. We're in the business of trying to help people make smart, strategic plays.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's important to just remember that, because again, this is only an 18-week regular season. If you only play main slates, 18 slates, regardless how many lineups, is a very small sample size. And I was just thinking that last night. I was pretty bummed. I played 4 lineups yesterday, didn't cash any of them. I had a good lineup going into the afternoon slate, and then Christian McCaffrey got like less than 10. And he probably wasn't actually that good of a play just because you could have bet on the Niners just systematically failing. But yeah, man, for me, I just feel like so many times this year I've hit those floating plays, but then it's like Saquon Barkley will have a very bad game for him, or whether it be CMC, Tyreek Hill several times, CD Lamb earlier in the season. But again, it's just small sample size. But at the same time, I could be overrating. It could be a little bit of recency bias to the positive for me, because I keep thinking, oh, CD Lamb had a great season last year, CMC, and maybe I'm overrating their past performances relative to what is currently happening. It's, but it's just a hard game, man. DFS is hard. We've talked about that, and it is
Tournaments
what it
are
is,
hard to win.
Yeah.
Tournaments are hard to win. You need everything or almost everything to go right. And you keep putting yourself in position where you just need that last thing, right? Like, and it won't always break your way, because every time that you're in a position where you just need that one last thing, there are a few hundred, depending on the size of the tournament, and there are dozens to hundreds to thousands of people who just need that one last thing to break their way. And it's easy to sit there and be like, oh, I'm so unlucky, I never get that last break. But there's so many other people who are also hoping for that last break. You're not going to get it every time, right? That you keep putting yourself in position where you just need that one last thing to break your way, to have a big week, and that's the name of the game, right? And we can't control that. We can't control the outcome there. But if you keep putting yourself in that spot, you keep putting yourself in the position where you just need that one last thing to break your way, it will at some point, right? It's just time. But that's how you're playing well. And in some ways, DFS is a game of frustration, because if you're playing well, you're going to find yourself in that position where you're so frustrated because you just needed that one last thing to break your way and it didn't. And that's a good sign, right? It means you're playing well. If you're not playing well, then you're nowhere close. You're not in a position where you're not going to sit there and be like, oh, I just needed this one thing. No, you need 17 things because you're.
That's a great way to think of it. Yeah.
So DFS is a game of frustration. I mean, I played some NBA GPPs this week, and I had one lineup finish. Well, I had one lineup in third place when I went to bed, and then in fifth place when I woke up because of stat correction. And it was like out of 20,000 or something like that. It was 100K to first, and I was like, I was almost there. And third place was still a decent win. I was like, okay, I'm fine. First place would have been nice, but third place is awesome. Would have, and then fifth place is like, and then on Friday I had another one where I was like, I needed something like 8 fantasy points from a guy in the second half of the game. He scored like 18 or 20 fantasy points in the first half, and I was like, okay, I only need like 8 more from him in the second half, and I have a chance to win. And I actually would have won. Like, there were other things, there were other lineups chasing, but they didn't get there, right? I ended up in like 5th or 6th place or something like that, and because my guy scored like 4 fantasy points in the entire second half, and he shot like 2 for 11. And again, it's like, I can sit there and be like, oh, it was so terrible. I was such a favorite to win. It's so unlucky. But we also forget about all the breaks that occur to even put us in that spot. I had to have gotten so many things to go my way to even be in that spot to begin with, right? So it's not like I'm like, oh, I'm so terribly unlucky. It's, I got a bunch of breaks to get me in that spot. I just didn't get the last one. But again, you keep putting yourself in that position, and you will get the breaks at some point, right? You're not going to get all of them. You're not going to win every tournament, but they'll come. So
yeah. Man, I miss NBA, dude, especially from I don't really do it right now, but I used to live on the West Coast. I used to live in Idaho, and way back in the day, and so I loved how the slate would start at 4 p.m. Late games would start at 7:30. A lot of times you could actually know what was going to happen before going to bed, whereas here it's like, I'd always have to go to bed with like late games start just tipping off on the East Coast. All that to say, though, I'm really excited to get into this showdown for tonight. But really quickly before we do, we had just talked briefly about a conversation you had with some people online about Sims, and just people saying yesterday, should we have been looking at Caleb Williams a double stack because of how the Sims were projecting that, and your thoughts on just kind of how to interpret Sims and just almost parlaying that into how to look at different game environments.
Yeah, so this is an interesting topic to me. I get a lot of these like sort of strategy topic ideas from the conversations we have in the 1 week season Discord, because there's a lot of very, very smart people in there. We have a lot of great conversations about strategy, about how to play better. So if you're not in there, I mean, it's a great resource. But some people were talking yesterday about like, should we have played Caleb Williams double stacks, and because they were simming really well. And so what Sims do, essentially Sims, you feed it a lineup, and it runs a Monte Carlo simulation, which basically like it simulates how the slate will play out thousands of times, and who scores what and where the fantasy points go, and then it tells you the expected ROI of a lineup. And so it's basically like another model of projections, where you take a player projection, and the player projection has a range of outcomes around it, though, right? So instead, the player might project for 20 points, but really his range of outcomes is, within 3 standard deviations is 12 to 28 points or whatever, right? And so Sims runs that and runs that a bunch of times and says, okay, in simulation number 137, Christopher McCaffrey scores 26 points, and this is how many all these guys score, and this is what the tournament standings would look like. So it's basically an attempt to kind of simulate, if we play the slate out 1,000 times or 10,000 times, what's likeliest to happen. And what's important to understand about simulations is, one, they aren't magic. They're just projections, really. And they're projections in a Monte Carlo sim. They're a useful tool if you know how to use it. The challenge is they're a bit of a black box. And I see people say this all the time. Well, the Sims liked this. I really don't know why. It's like, okay, cool. If you don't know why, like, I'd personally have a hard time putting a lot of money in play based on some kind of like black box machine that I don't understand why it's saying what it's saying. So I think it's important to understand like how Sims arrive at what they do, and it's important to understand the advantages and disadvantages of them. Because Sims are trying to project ROI, they simulate out a bunch of scores, and so ownership is incredibly important because of the way they simulate the slate. So like they simulate, say, Kareem Hunt scores a bunch of points yesterday. Kareem Hunt was really highly owned. So if you have a bunch of Kareem Hunt, him scoring a bunch of points doesn't help you as much as, say, Bucky Irving scoring a ton of points, because Bucky Irving was low owned. Now, this makes sense, of course, right? If Kareem Hunt is 60% owned and he scores 25 points, well, 60% of the field you've kept pace with. You've perhaps gotten an advantage of the other 40% of the field, but it's still a lot of people you're competing with. If Bucky Irving scores 25 points, it's a much larger percentage of the field that you're gaining ground on. So this all makes sense, right? And this makes sense to anyone who's played DFS for a little while. The challenge with the Sims is, because of the way that they calculate ROI, they tend to overweight really low ownership, because ownership is such a factor to them. And so the point is like, they say, okay, if you find this like 0.5% owned or 1% owned guy, it's likely to, like, if he hits, it's going to propel you forward by a much wider degree.
Yeah.
The challenge there is that, DFS and playing DFS tournaments and thinking about ownership in DFS tournaments is a mixture of art and science, right? We know that if we build a lineup of all the highest owned plays, it's likely going to project really well. Like, for the projections are going to say this lineup is likely to score a lot of points. But we also know it's going to be very highly owned, and we're not going to differentiate from the field. If we play a lineup of all players who are 2% owned or less, we're going to be massively differentiated from the field, but we're going to give up a ton of projection, right, in order to build this massively differentiated lineup.
Yeah.
So finding the sweet spot there is what's important, right? Regular projections, just running an optimizer with projections, doesn't pay any attention to ownership. And so it's going to skew. If you imagine that sort of like low ownership versus high ownership, low projection versus high projection as a sort of range of outcomes, as a gradient, you can choose where you want to fall on that gradient. The regular projections are going to skew towards the point side of things, because they don't care about ownership, right? So they're going to tend to if you just start running optimals without setting rules or anything like that, you're going to get a bunch of optimal lineups filled with very highly owned players because regular projections don't care about ownership. So they skew towards the point side of things, not paying attention to ownership. Sims tend to skew the other way, and they tend to overweight ownership. Now, ownership is important, but they do tend to overweight ownership. And so they tend to build you a lot of lineups that have, or rate highly a lot of lineups that they're filled with really low owned plays. And fine, that's great. It's good to be differentiated. But the downside is they often lead you to lineups that are giving up too much projection, as in they're filled with really low owned players. And if they all hit, yes, your ROI is likely to be very high because you have a lineup that no one's playing any of these players. But you're also playing a lineup of all, they tend to guide you to lineups of all sub 5% owned players, which are generally lower chances to hit than higher owned players because the field's pretty good at identifying players who are more likely to have good games. And so if you build lineups of all 1% or 2% or 3% on players, yeah, your sim ROI is going to look awesome because no one's on those plays. But if they hit, the chance of them all hitting together, it's very, very small. So on that gradient of likelihood to occur versus what you win when it does occur, that's the weakness. And it's not that sims are bad. It's just they're a tool. And you have to understand how the tool works, right? And so I personally am a little wary of using sims, of over-reliance on sims to choose games to target because it's always going to lead you away from the best game environments. It's always going to lead you to the lowest owned games. That's the way that sims calculate. And you can be successful playing that way, right? Like Utica is obviously big name DFS player, one of the best DFS players in the world. He talks about how the number one reason he's successful is because he's not afraid to not play the best plays. Cool. You can be successful as a highly contrarian player. There's a lot of styles of play that work in DFS, right? You can be successful as a chalkier player. You can be successful as a highly contrarian player. Both work. But what I caution people about is being successful as a highly contrarian player. And I don't mean a little. I mean ignoring all the top game environments and going and building Will Levis and Caleb Williams double stacks yesterday. That's a highly contrarian play style. And what that means is when you win, when you hit, when you get it right, you're going to be in position to win a lot because you're going to be in places that most people aren't. But you're also those wins are going to be few and far between because you're targeting much less likely to occur outcomes. Again, is that plus EV? Sure, it absolutely can be. But you're likely to have a lot of negative 100% ROI weeks in between. And so it's a question of risk management, risk tolerance, a question of bankroll management. It's a question of can you as a player tolerate this play style where you might lose 16 weeks of the season in hopes that those last 1 or 2 weeks, win enough to make it worth it. And again, it's not about, is that an E plus EV play style? It can be, but it's a stressful and play style that you have to have the discipline and bankroll to sustain over a long period of time in between those wins. The wins can be really big. So again, that's a viable play style, but just make sure that if you go that route, that you know what you're getting into, right? You're going to win less often. Hopefully when you do, you'll win more. It's a more volatile play style. Should we have considered more Caleb Williams double stacks? Maybe, I don't know, right? It's hard to say. I think for me, my play style, I am generally speaking a chalkier player, and I generally am my strength as a player is generally identifying where there's good chalk and where there's not so good chalk, and filling out lineups around the good chalk pieces. That's my strength as a player. It's not the only strength there is. Caleb Williams is more of a high-low play. If you listen to high-low on our show, he's the one who often finds these off the wall, I'm going to stack Drake May. I'm going to stack, he often finds these out of nowhere kind of game stacks that oh, okay, that actually makes sense now that you explain it. So I get the case for Caleb Williams. Minnesota faces a high pass rate because they have an elite run defense. They tend to play from ahead, right? So Minnesota tends to face a very high pass rate. As a result of their defense being really good and their offense being good, so they tend to play from ahead. So the high pass rate generally is good. We want, lots of pass volume is good. I think that, it's not my style to attack one of the best defenses in the league with one of the weakest offenses in the league. But I get it. But I get it because on some level, if you really simplify DFS down, you really simplify NFL down, you go make a list of here's all the offenses in the slate. Where are the offenses that are likely to pass at an elevated rate? where the offense is the pass volume is likely to pile up. It's fair to say the Bears could have been on that list, right? The Bears should have been on the list of a likely above average volume spot. Now, keep in mind, the Bears also like hit in the last 2 minutes of the game through a fairly unlikely series of outcomes, right? But again, like you need outlier outcomes, right? Like that's
you do, yeah.
you need outlier outcomes to win games. So that's not like necessarily a criticism, so to speak, right? Like, but they did score, at the very end of the game. They got it. They got the touchdown to, was it DJ? I think it was DJ Morris that scored the last touchdown, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
They also managed it in a very, very concentrated manner. So if you double stacked with like DJ Moore and Keenan Allen, you were like sitting pretty because all the passing, like over half of the passing yardage went to those two guys. So it worked out. It was, it worked out great for anyone who took that risk. And I'm not here to tell you that like you should take that risk. You shouldn't take that risk. It was a good play or bad play, right? Like, it's not my style of play, but it worked out, and and it worked. And it's not like it wasn't a sharp play. I mean, like if you just looked at where you can pile up passing volume at low ownership, that's a viable strategy. I'd argue that Caleb Williams and the Bears, with what we know they've done on offense this year against the Vikings defense and what we know they've done on defense this year, was a spot that was going to hit at a very low rate, right? It's a very low likelihood of hitting. But when it did, it's a spot that very few people were going to be on because it's the Bears against the Vikings defense. And that's why the Sims liked it, right? So the point thing to understand about Sims, like they're not magic, right? Like they're just going to look for low owned spots. That's it. They're going to look for low owned spots with reasonably high ceilings. And so they overweight ownership. That's okay, possibly. But just make sure you know what you're getting into with them. They can be a useful tool. I personally like to use them for once I figured out a game I like. Like, let's say I figure out that I like Seattle, Arizona.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, actually, this is the example of how I use them this week. They told me, and this matched with the other analysis we've done with OWS, which is why I decided to go with it. But what the Sims told me is that if I built lineups around Geno single or Geno double stacks, those were likely to be lower ROI than Kyler Murray single or double stacks.
Okay.
Because though that game was attracting some ownership, most of the ownership was focused on the Seattle side. It's like, Geno Smith projected for double the ownership of Kyler Murray, but Kyler Murray has a higher ceiling than Geno Smith, right? This all matches the analysis we've done with that we did in ODS we talked about too, and we wrote about. So it's not like the only way to get to this conclusion is from Sims, right? You can get to it from other ways.
Yeah, you guys talked about this on the slate, I remember.
Yeah. But the question is like, should I single stack? Should I double stack? Like the ROI calculation can help you determine what's advantageous there, right? Is it better to single stack? Is it better to double stack? I don't know, but Sims can help me figure that out. They can help me answer that question. So like that's where Sims can be useful to me. Like figuring out once I've targeted a game, what's the best way to attack it, or things like, in this lineup, like I have this line, I built this lineup. I built a lineup, say, around Arizona, Seattle. Well, that's a kind of chalky game. It's going to attract some ownership. So how should I build around the rest of that lineup, right? Like, is it better to have Kareem Hunt or Bucky Irving in that? This is an obvious one. Better to have Bucky Irving because we know this could be a higher owned game already. But like those kind of questions, like what should I put around this? Like, and so like I see a lot of people in our Discord asking questions like, I have this lineup, I have this last 1v1 or 2v2. What fits best here? Sims are really good for that kind of question. Right? Looking at the rest of your lineup, because you can run Sims on both versions. So you can say, I have this lineup, what's the best last piece? And Sims are good at saying, oh, okay, well, given all this stuff that you have in the lineup already, this is what projects best as the last piece. And that helps you kind of sort out like, well, how owned is the rest of the lineup? How chalky is the rest of the lineup likely to be? And so what fits best as the last piece, the last two pieces. So Sims are really good at that stuff. They can be a very useful tool. I'm cautious with them because of the sort of black box nature of them. They don't explain how they work, right? They just sort of spit stuff out. And it's like, here's your EV calculation. You're like, okay, how do you get this? And so I'm wary of black box stuff where I don't understand how it gets to its conclusions. Like that makes me nervous. So, I think they're a useful tool, but I think they're a tool that you want to be somewhat cautious with. But they can be a very, very useful tool if you're cautious with it.
Yeah, great explanation, Xandamere. Really, that's helpful for me even to hear. And just it comes back to it's a great tool, but you kind of explained It does overweight ownership, but again, also I think it just underscores the importance of knowing what your personal play style is. If you're just gonna, see that Caleb Williams was overrated or was rated well by the Sims and be like, I'm going to start using Sims for all my play style, like that's going to be definitely a more volatile approach. But yeah, just really loved how you explained that and broke that down. Super helpful. So unless there's anything else you want to add with that, you ready to jump in and look at this showdown matchup?
Let's get into it.
Let's get into it, man. Here we go. All right, let me just pull this up and actually, let me pull up DraftKings first here. So Chargers hosting the Ravens tonight. Man, we finally get. I feel like we've had some kind of, not as exciting island games to talk about on this show, but tonight, we've got a pretty good one.
Oh man, this is an awesome one, right? Like this game looks like fun. Like a lot of fun.
Yeah, just two of my favorite players in the NFL, Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry. Of course, the Chargers are, they're still a good name brand, a fun name brand, and they've actually been, putting up more points lately. So, yeah, where do you want to start in terms of like looking at this game, looking at who you want to, kind of the game script and who you want to go with at captain?
Yeah, so the high level here is, this certainly looks like a shootout, right? With high game totals, we have a Ravens team that has scored the second highest scoring team in the NFL behind the Lions. The Ravens are allowing a ton of points. They're allowing they're a major pass funnel defense. They're one of the best teams in the league against the run, one of the worst teams in the league against the pass. So major pass funnel. On the Chargers side, we have a team that's been scoring more points of late, a team that's been opening up its offense of late. Its pass rate has climbed. Right? The Chargers have one of the lowest pass rates in the league the first 4 games of the season. But since then, since their bye, the week by, they've attempted 31 passes a game, which is not, elite, but it's climbed a fair bit. We've got a Chargers defense that is allowing the fewest points of any team in the league, and a shockingly few points. The question is like, how real is that? I think there's a bit of a mirage there. It's, I don't think they're as good as their points allowed number looks. They've faced a lot of bad teams. They've had a really soft schedule. They faced a lot of bad offenses, but they're clearly a good defense. Like they're clearly an above average defense, right? The question is not, are they good or are they bad? The question is, are they historically elite or just good? And I would argue they're good. They're in the good tier. Like if you go look at, they face like Las Vegas, Carolina, Pittsburgh, the Chiefs, who are actually not that great of an offense. The Broncos earlier in the season before Bo Nix started dismantling everybody, right? Like the Cardinals, good team. The Saints, but the Saints banged up and everyone hurt, right? Cleveland. So they faced a lot of mediocre offenses. The Bengals put up 27 against them last week, right? So I think the Ravens, could the Chargers shut down the Ravens? Anything's possible, right? But the Ravens have scored at least 20 points in every single game but one last week against the Steelers. Right, that was a divisional matchup against one of the league's best defenses. So are the Ravens, could the Ravens be stopped? Of course they can, right? But I think it's likely the Ravens are going to find a way to score, and it's likely the Chargers are going to find a way to score. And for the Chargers especially, it's likely that scoring is going to come through the air. So that creates, a pretty narrow distribution of how we think like the likeliest play is the likeliest outcome is going to be. Like the likeliest outcome is, Ravens, and then Chargers passing game. And the Ravens offense it's very concentrated at the very top, right? With like Lamar Jackson, Derrick Henry, Zay Flowers. Mm-hmm. And then it sort of branched past that. It gets very scattered. You've got all these like ancillary players who can hit or can, especially in the context of Showdown, like in the context of main slate, the Ravens are a hard offense because they don't tend to generate big ceilings from their other players. But in the context of Showdown, like they can do plenty to generate enough of a ceiling from their other players. Yeah. So, so we also have the slate dynamic of like, there's really no Chargers value. Like if you go look below, and when I say value in Showdown, I always mean like price below the kickers. But like you go look at like the Chargers value pieces below the kickers, and it's like Gus Edwards. And then it's like, Darius Davis and Jalen Reagor, who barely play, and DJ Chark, who was inactive, and I thought he was going to, it's weird they signed him and just aren't playing him. Because he is a good player.
Nothing down here. Absolutely nothing.
Yeah, so the Chargers essentially have nobody, right? Yeah. I will note, Lad McConkey is questionable. And if he misses, it's hard for the Chargers to replace him, like just in the routes he runs. The most direct replacement for him, based on what we've seen this season in terms of routes that they've run, would be Darius Davis. The problem is Darius Davis is awful, and so there's another way they could go, which is move Josh Palmer into Lad McConkey's like slot role, which Josh Palmer had some experience running some of last year, and then move someone else out to replace Josh Palmer in the perimeter. And that, they'll most likely be boring and run Jalen Reagor out there, who is also terrible. But it's possible that if Lad McConkey is out, we could see DJ Chark be active. We could see Josh Palmer run more of the slot routes, and then DJ Chark run on the perimeter opposite Quentin Johnson. So we'll see. Like, Lad McConkey is obviously a big deal. He's the wide receiver one. He's the target leader on the team. If he misses, it's a huge deal for the game. And it would swing a lot. It would swing a lot of ownership and a lot of decision making, in that game. So,
yeah, no doubt about that. Yeah, I mean, yeah, but you're right, man. It just everyone's going to want to fit in the studs here, but there is just, you're going to be drawing thin, for value. So
yeah, well, then you got the Ravens are where the value comes from on the slate, right? Because you've got multiple guys down below the kickers who I think are viable plays. You've got the tight ends, right? Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely are cheap. You've got Nelson Aguilar. You've got
Justice
Tyson
Hill. I mean, he can
Justice Hill.
He can get a touchdown on a reception. He's kind of their third down back.
Yeah, so there's a lot of guys priced down there who have viability, who I think are, that's where the value comes from. Like they're all most of them are pretty thin, right? Justice Hill, Mark Andrews, pretty decent floor, but then you've got like Nelson Aguilar, like Tyson Wallace. There's a lot of these really thin guys like Deontay Johnson, who they signed and are not playing, and he's a very weird signing for them. Because Deontay Johnson's primarily a slot receiver, and the Ravens run heavy personnel at one of the highest rates in the league, and so there just aren't a lot of slot receiver snaps available. So kind of an odd fit for them, but there's a lot of plays down there that you can get to. They're all thin, but there's a lot of viable options, and my suspicion is because of how many there are, I think it's highly likely to me. And because the salary dynamic of the slate, it is highly likely to me that we are going to see a winning tournament lineup with at least one player priced below the kickers. And that's not exactly a bold take, right? Like we usually see someone below the kickers in a tournament lineup. But my take is, like, I think that we're going to see that this week in particular. Like, I think it's likely that we're going to get there this week with a below the kicker play.
Yeah, no, I could absolutely see it.
We'll find out.
All right, so yeah, man, who do you want to go with the stud at captain, or were you trying to fit in a value angle on this lineup?
Yeah, so it's hard, right? Like, there's a lot of viable options. There's so many good stud plays. My favorite play at captain overall, if he plays, is Lad McConkey. And I'm assuming he plays for the purposes of this, right? The purposes of the lineup. Because he did get in 2 limited practices, so I think it's more likely than not that he plays. I haven't seen.
I'm going to pop him in here.
Well, not quite yet. I'm just I'm just talking it through, right? So he's my favorite play, my favorite captain play. Chargers Ravens are a massive pass funnel defense, right? Awful against the pass, elite against the run. So he is my overall favorite play in the game, and I think of it in a very valuable captain play, my favorite captain play. There is another path, right? Like, I think that the other path is trying to find a cheaper captain who doesn't put up the highest score in the game, but puts up a high enough score that lets you fit other pieces. So if your goal is to avoid dipping down into the super thin value range, you could run, say, like a Mark Andrews at captain, a Will Dissly, a Josh Palmer, a Rashad Bateman. We're one of the less expensive captains, so that's that is an option if you're trying to avoid the super thin value range. But in this lineup, I am going to go Lad McConkey captain. So let's plop Lad in there.
All right, okay, he's in.
Yeah. So now let's start the 2 obvious decisions. Let's put in Justin Herbert and Lamar Jackson.
Right. Okay.
So
yes,
this is a fairly obvious start to a lineup. This is not being tricky or sneaky, right? Like, I have a receiver, so I generally, not always, but I generally want his quarterback, because if he has a big game, that means more production for the quarterback, right? It's likely he drags the quarterback along with him, highly correlated. And then Lamar Jackson is just the single strongest piece of the Ravens because so much of the offense flows through him. And you could make a strong case. You can make a strong case in any Ravens showdown this year that every lineup should have at least one of Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry, because that's the offense. That's so much of the offense flows through those guys. So you can make a very strong case that every Ravens showdown, you need one of those guys. It wasn't the case in past years because they didn't used to have running backs that they used like they used Derrick Henry. They used to have running backs that they capped their touches. They didn't give them huge workloads. So anyway,
Ravens used to be so hard with Showdown, but they're a lot more fun to play as a team now that Derrick Henry is
They were literally my least favorite team for Showdowns, like for a long time. They're so spread out. Like it was so tilting trying to play them.
Gus Edwards, J.K. Dobbins, whoever the hell else they had at running back.
Drove me effing crazy.
Yeah.
So anyway, okay, let's keep moving. So now we have now we have the core of the lineup, and now we know that we're going to need to find some cheaper plays. We got 5,000 roughly left per player, and so the most obvious value play on the slate to me, and again I define value as price below the kickers, is Mark Andrews. So Mark Andrews started the season incredibly cold, right? Like if you scroll down, like he had 2 targets week 1 against the Chiefs when Isaiah Likely went absolutely berserk. Now that was because the Chiefs were bracketing him the entire game, right? If you actually go back to watch the game, they were putting him in bracket coverage the entire game, and so that opened up Isaiah Likely for that huge game he had. Chiefs were basically saying, we're not letting Mark Andrews beat us. 5 targets next game, and then one target, and that was like, and people were starting to say, like, is Mark Andrews done? Is Mark Andrews like, is he dust? Is he done? Now scroll up to the top of his game logs, and viewers, if you can see this, like his targets look a little healthier. The Ravens are not a super high volume passing offense. He's not likely to get 10 targets, right? That's not how their offense works. But what you see here, 4 touchdowns in the last 5 games, 3 of the last 5 games, 14.6 DraftKings points or more. So that will do, right? At 4,600, if he scores 14.6 DraftKings points, he is almost certainly in the optimal lineup. So he is a really strong value play to me. He's, the Ravens are all volatile. Like all Ravens pass catchers are volatile, right? Because of the nature of their offense, because of it being a lower volume passing offense. But Mark Andrews, I think his red zone role has climbed back up. Like his role is bigger. And if you look at his salary, it's like yo-yoed around. Like week 8, 5,000, week 9, 7,200, week 10, 4,200, week 11, 7,400. So like catching him on the lower swing of his salary, I think makes a lot of sense. I think that DK clearly doesn't know where he should be priced. They're kind of bouncing him around because they don't know what's going on with his role and where he should be priced. So I think it's clear he's on the lower end of his salary range right now. I think he's only been cheaper than this once. So like he's at his second cheapest salary of the season, despite having 3 of his last 5 games been very strong games. So like he is too cheap, I think, objectively for what where he's been and what he's done in the last few games. So he is my favorite value play on the slate. So we can plug him in.
All right. Sounds good. So yeah, 2 spots left and a total of just under 11K left.
Yeah. So here's where we get to an interesting decision. So we could, if we want, we could plug in a high-end play. Like we have room for, say, Zay Flowers. And then we have to have a total punt play in there, which is, we could do that. Right. We could viably do that. Or we could do 2 mid-range plays. And so this is where I think it gets tough and it becomes a lot of, personal preference. All the super cheap value plays are really thin, right? Like they're going to project for 1 to 2 points or under 1 point. Like you could put in Jalen Reagor and Zay Flowers, right? And that's viable. You're going to need Jalen Reagor to catch, he probably needs at least 4 or 5 points, which he's only done twice. So, could he? Of course he could. It's a good matchup for him too, because he's kind of a deep threat receiver and he could get there in 1 catch. Or you could do, say, a mid-range tier. You could do a Will Dissly, who also has a great matchup and has been much more involved with the offense. You could do a Will Dissly and a Justice Hill, or a higher floor value play, Mr. Justice Hill, right? Or you could do a Rashad Bateman and a kicker, right? Rashad Bateman and one of the kickers. So there's a lot of options in this price range. I am going to guess, let's take a step back for a minute and think about what this lineup is saying so far, right?
Yeah, I like it.
So there's a couple ways that this lineup could hit, right? If you think about what this lineup is saying, it's not saying anything yet about who wins the game necessarily, right? It's not saying for example, if I had Derrick Henry instead of Lamar Jackson, then what it's likely saying is the Ravens are playing from ahead, because Derrick Henry's his volume is piling up. He's getting into the end zone, and the Chargers are elevating their pass rate in response. So if I had Derrick Henry instead of Lamar Jackson, then Zay Flowers would probably not be an optimal play here, right? Zay Flowers would also probably not be an optimal play because I already have a Ravens pass catcher, so I'd have 2 Ravens pass catchers without the quarterback. If both Zay Flowers and Mark Andrews hit, it's more likely that Lamar Jackson hits than it is that Derrick Henry hits, right? So you got to think about correlation in these decisions.
Yeah.
So right now, I've not said anything about who wins the game. This is kind of an open-ended lineup. It really could go either direction. You could do kind of whatever you want with it because there's no restriction here in terms of like the story being told. So I do feel that in these lineups, I often build them pretty conservatively, and that's usually like I try not to go out on like wild limbs on these shows, right? So I try not to play like the super punt plays that I have no idea if they're going to hit because like we're usually building these for not the massive GPP contests. We're usually building these for the smaller contests.
Right. And almost like a shell, a shell where you can build off of this kind of main core if you wanted to.
That's a really good way of putting it. I like that. So I like this as a shell. I really like this. I think this is a strong shell lineup. And I think you can go a bunch of different directions. However, in this, I'm going to take a little bit more of a risk than I normally do. Okay. And I am going to go with Zay Flowers and Jalen Reagor. And Jalen Reagor is like one of my least favorite players in the league. But let me explain this one. So we already have Lamar Jackson and a pass catcher. So we're doubling up on Lamar Jackson, 2 pass catchers, saying essentially the Ravens score through the air in this game, which is the easier matchup against the Chargers. We're saying the Ravens score through the air, and that Lamar Jackson, the run game doesn't get it going for the Ravens, which is that's a tough run matchup. But if Lamar Jackson at 11,000 has a big game, he's either getting there through supporting multiple pass catchers or he's getting there by like rushing in scores, right? So like I like the multiple pass catchers with him. Zay Flowers' target share on this offense is so good, and he is so good, right? Like we're talking about a player that's only gotten to 10 targets this season a handful of times because the Ravens are not a super high pass volume offense. But he's still gotten to 20 points, 5 times this year.
Yeah.
So really, I love like one of my, and I'm biased. He's one of my favorite players. And then Jalen Reagor is not a good player, but the reason I think he's one of the more interesting punt players this week is because what he does do is he runs way down the field fairly fast. If you look at his catches this year, he's only had a couple catches, right? But he's averaging 19 yards per catch. Like he gets these are deep targets he gets, and except for the one in week 9 against Cleveland where he caught a ball on the line of scrimmage and did not move. 1 catch for 0 yards. But generally he's getting like deep targets, right? And that's the way to beat the Ravens, right? So like he's probably only going to get 1 or 2 targets this game, but it's likely those targets are to come 15 yards downfield, and that's how you beat the Ravens. So it's thin because all these punt plays are thin, but to me, this is one of the better matchups that Jalen Reagor is going to have for what he does, which is run downfield and hope to get a long catch. And so if he gets that 1 long catch or 2 long catches, even if he doesn't get in the end zone, right? Like week 7 against Arizona, 1 catch for 41 yards, he fumbled, but take the fumble out. That would have been 5.1 points. That might be enough at 800, right? So like, that's the kind of play when I look at value plays, I try to find plays, like ideally I try to find plays who have a chance at being optimal without a touchdown. Because if you're just playing like throw darts at the dartboard and hope for touchdowns, like you can do that, but like there's nothing that points you towards those plays really. You're just kind of like buying lottery tickets and hoping to get lucky. Yeah. And, for me, I like to try to find something something where there's data that points to some element of success. And for me, for Reagor, like he at least has a possibility of hitting without getting in the end zone. And so those are my favorite punt plays, are ones that I can say, yeah, I can see a path where this guy doesn't have to get a touchdown in order to hit. Most of the time, those cheap punt plays, like you kind of need a lucky touchdown for them to have a chance. So I like the ones that don't necessarily need a touchdown. And I think that Reagor could get, 4, 5, 6 points, and that could possibly be enough, right? That could do it. So it's
Absolutely,
a riskier lineup than I normally go with for the show, but Jalen Reagor, God kill me, but that's what I'm going with.
Awesome, man. Yeah, for the podcast, the one we finished on was Lad McConkey, captain, then Justin Herbert, Lamar Jackson, Mark-Andrew Flowers, and Jalen Reagor. And to the Reagor point, I mean, he is an even thinner play than last week with you plugging in Cavante Turpin. But Turpin, man, he worked out last week, took a short slant and then went 74 yards for a touchdown. So, yeah, I mean, again, all you need is a long bomb down the field, 140-yard catch. That's 5 points. That would probably be enough for this lineup to at least have a shot. Anyway, yeah, good stuff, man. Xandamere, as always.
A pleasure, my friends.
Awesome, guys. Good luck for tonight. Hope you get a chance to put in some lineups. And, yeah, obviously this is an exciting week. We got, in front of us the Thanksgiving slate. It feels like a holiday because I guess it actually is. So, yeah, Xandamere, great stuff. We'll talk to you later in the week with some Thanksgiving stuff we got coming up. But until then, good luck tonight, and we'll talk to you soon.